Hi everyone. Today's lecture is on hominins and bipedalism. This is chapter 14 or lab 14. This one's kind of short. And we've already talked about a little of this with the primate stuff, but now we're going to get into a lot more of it. And so if some of this seems like a little bit of a repeat, that's fine. And then from this bipedalism talk, as well as like the features of the hominins, and then for chapters 15 and 16, we'll be moving into learning all of those species within the hominin lineage. So moving through this particular PowerPoint, if you're following along, so the first slide. So it says hominins, right? And so this is anything in our lineage since our split with chimpanzees, which occurred approximately like 6 million years ago. Everything in the human lineage. So it's not a nice straight line, right? There, I mean, I have a little, picture on the PowerPoint slide. It makes it look like a nice straight line. But everything in our lineage, we had some stuff at the beginning, then there were some branching events, certain branches, died off, certain ones continued. Everything still in that particular lineage is still considered a hominin, right? So whether it's in our direct ancestry or kind of a branching event within our ancestry, it's all still considered a hominin. Everything since the split with chimps. Now, remember, humans did not evolve from chimpanzees, right? We did not evolve from them, but we share common ancestry. And so that ancestor that we share was about 6 million years ago. There was a split or cladogenesis, recall. In our lineage, evolved along different trajectories, some branching events within, and then the chimp lineage as well evolved along their own trajectories. And so eventually at the end, we have modern chimps and modern humans, and of course, hopefully those lines will both continue on to something else. But so everything in our lineage is considered a hominin with an N. Now, you might be looking at these images here where I have 3 ape species, a gorilla, a chimp, and a human. And I wanted to point this out because, so we use the term hominin with an N, but if you have like an older instructor or you're looking at an older textbook, or it just depends on a few different factors, you might see the term hominid with a D. This is like the old phrasing. We say hominin with an N now, but contextually, hopefully it would make sense to you. Unfortunately, we still use the term hominid, but to mean like something else now. So, but this is like going back to what I had said before earlier in the semester about science, changing with new evidence. Essentially, like if you look at those 3 images and I said, all 3 of them are related, but 2 of them are slightly like more closely related to each other than either one of them is to the third, you might look at those like visually and see, okay, well, maybe the chimps and the gorillas are more closely related to each other, and while they're both related to humans are kind of like the odd one out. And in fact, as we get DNA and stuff, we realize, that's not actually the case. Humans and chimps are actually more closely related to each other than either one of us is to the gorilla. And so then, some naming, categorization changes happen as, in science we change with new evidence. And so that's why we kind of see this name shift. But moving on to the next slide, you will see 6 traits that all hominins share. So recall, previously we talked about all of the traits that primates share, right? Like opposable thumb, enclosed eye orbits, higher EQ or larger brains, reduced prognathism. Why am I blanking? What else? Singleton births, long period of being a juvenile, strong mother-infant bond. Like you guys recall the list, right? But now we're getting more specific with just the human lineage. So humans obviously were primates, so we talk about the larger group of primates, opposable thumb and stuff like that, right? But when we look at just the human lineage, our lineage, these are the 6 traits we would look for. And before we go through the 6, you will see at the bottom there's something that says, important to remember mosaic evolution. Now, to be clear, mosaic evolution is not a force of evolution. Recall we talked about the 5 forces of evolution: natural selection, gene flow, genetic drift, non-random mating, aka sexual selection, and mutation, right? Those are the 5. So mosaic evolution is not a force, it's just a conceptual idea or a concept. So basically what this means is whenever you have a group of traits or what we call a suite of traits that we use to like characterize, oh, this one particular group or this other particular group. In this case, we're using these 6 to represent, hominins. It's important to remember, this is what mosaic evolution is. They did not happen at the same time, and they didn't occur at the same rate. And so as we go through these, this will make sense. And so we can look at this list of 6, and I've got slides for each of them, but we can go through right now just and see. We've got bipedal locomotion, larger brain size, parabolic dental arch, reduced prognathism, no CP3 hone, and thick enamel. So if you're like, oh, I know what some of those are, some of them I'm not sure, we're going to go through them. But it's important to remember these all didn't happen. It's not like the very first hominin had all of these things and then the rest of us all look the same, right? These happen at different times. Bipedalism, as an example, happened right at the very beginning of our lineage. Big brains didn't happen until a bit later. So we'll go through these. So the next slide, you'll see the first one, larger brain size. Remember, this is not a reference to absolute brain size. It's a reference to encephalization quotient, or EQ, the brain size to body mass. Humans and those in our lineage, compared to the other primates, we have a larger brain than you would expect for an animal like of our body mass, right, of our size, right? And so when you look at all of animals and you see, okay, here we have body sizes and brains, when you see animals that have a larger brain size compared to the body mass, this typically maps onto some kind of, cognitive ability, and for each species, that's going to be something, different. So when we say larger brains, that's what we mean. But you can see here just the comparison of the absolute brain size of like a modern human versus a chimpanzee. Now, of course, we did not evolve from chimps, right? But they do look more similar to the ancestor than we do. We have a lot more derived traits in our lineage. And so we can see, kind of using them as like an analog. A modern chimp has a cranial capacity of around 400 cc's or cubic centimeters. And then a modern human has around like 1350 on average. So a massive difference there, right? But also, as we see in our lineage, we see more of like a lot more of the head up here, versus you can see in the chimp, a lot of their head or brain is kind of behind their eyes. In the human lineage, we see variations of this, but we tend to see more kind of up here on top rather than just all of it behind the eyes. And so we actually get more of a forehead. Now, of course, there's no goal in evolution to having a forehead. Of course not. That's just, but we can reflect back and see, oh, like that's what happened. Okay. Now, the next slide, bipedalism. You guys know what this one is, right? We're going to go into a little more detail on this. But bipedalism is, walking on 2 limbs or your hind limbs. We, as humans, and those in the hominin lineage, all of them all bipedal, right? Now, we are not the only bipedal primates to have ever existed. A few million years ago, there were definitely some other primates who were bipedal, but, humans were the only one that currently exists now, and our lineage is like the most recent for those who were, bipedal. Next slide, the parabolic dental arch. You can see here in the image the comparison between the chimp and the human, and it's showing you their parallel tooth row. So the back teeth, the molars and premolars, it's kind of, parallel. It's like they're right like this, versus in the human, and of course the other hominins in our lineage, which we'll get into the species names later, we have that nice kind of arch to our teeth. Essentially, the explanation is, as evolution's occurring, our faces tend to get a bit like flatter and smaller in our lineage, and so we still have the same number of teeth. So to accommodate that, like the shape the teeth kind of take in the mouth shifts a little bit. Next slide, reduced prognathism. So going hand in hand with what I just said, right? So you can see here like a generalized ape, probably like something chimp-like, and then the human. And so reduced prognathism. Remember, prognathism is the projection of the face. Now, primates, compared to non-primates, primates definitely have like a reduced snout. We tend to have flatter faces. But looking at just the human lineage within primates, we see that we have even flatter facial profiles. So we have fairly flat faces. The next slide, so we have 2 on this slide, no CP3 hone and thick enamel. So thick enamel, all hominins have thick enamel, versus like other apes, like chimps, gorillas, whatever, have thin enamel on their teeth. So our lineage is definitely like a deviation from that, and then we have thick enamel on our teeth. and then no CP3 hone. So we didn't really go into this in the primates. Well, I didn't like use the terms, but basically you could see this image here where it's that really large upper canine, the smaller like lower canine, and then the premolar like right next to it. And you can see the premolar and the lower canine have that space between them. We call that a diastema. And that diastema, that large space, kind of accommodates in the mouth like that large upper canine. And the whole system of those lower teeth kind of serve to sharpen that upper canine. It's like a whole system, right? And so we see this in a lot of other primates when they have the large canines, if you recall, is not for diet, but for sexual selection, right? So, and those in our lineage, we don't have this whole complex of like a sharper upper canine, Basically the canine, even in the first species in our lineage, that canine drops very quickly to like a medium size and then basically ends up being the same size as the incisors like the rest of the time. So in terms of the human lineage, we have sexual dimorphism between males and females, but we just don't have it in the canine, right? So we see the canine dimorphism in a lot of other species. The male canine will be really big, and the female canine will still be a pretty decent size. But canine for humans, we just don't have that in terms of dimorphism in our lineage. But we do have size and shape differences in like the rest of our bony structure. Okay, so now moving on, like I said, to bipedalism, a little bit more on bipedalism. You'll see bipedal morphology, and here is showing like a generalized ape and a human side by side, and they're both kind of upright, so you can see these comparisons. So the first thing is that the foramen magnum placement. Recall we talked about this when we were talking about the primates versus, quadruped versus biped. So think of that. Remember that all of the species in the human lineage, they're all bipedal. That's like the hallmark of the human lineage, right? And so the placement of the foramen magnum on a biped is going to be like directly underneath, underneath the skull, versus in a quadruped it's going to be more towards the back of the skull. The vertebral column also, so you can see here in this image, we have kind of like an S-shaped curve, like it's kind of like a really skinny, elongated S. It's kind of like this. We essentially have two main curves, the cervical and the lumbar curve. Cervical is up on top, lumbar is like in the lower part of our back. And these two curves kind of develop within the lifetime of that individual. Cervical curve starts to develop when that individual can hold up its own head. So recall, like human babies are born what we call altricial. Let me see if I can spell it. Altricial, altricial. Basically, this just means helpless, and this is in contrast to some other species have babies. They're born precocial, where they're born, they can like walk on their own or find their own food within hours or days and stuff, maybe even a few weeks. But for humans, it's months, if not years, to where we can start to do that as humans. So our babies are born very helpless. We can get into the rest of that, the reasons why later, but yeah, so cervical curve will develop when individuals can start to hold up their own head, and then the lumbar curve will start to occur when those individuals are starting to walk. And then you see in the ape, as a comparison, it's not like the vertebral column's not like just bored straight, right? There is like one kind of curve to it, but that's it. The next slide, more on the bipedal morphology. So you can see here the pelvic girdle, or allergies. The pelvis, right? In the human, we've seen this, right? It's kind of this bowl shaped because we're bipedal, because it's holding up like a big portion of like 2/3 of the body weight, right? And so for the others in the human lineage, they're all bipedal, the same pelvis shape. And you can see this in the image, and then you can see next to it the quadruped or the chimp pelvis, how it's much more elongated. If you recall from the primate, we had this out on the exam and stuff, where it's much more elongated because the body weight isn't sitting on top of it, so it doesn't need to like catch the body weight, right? The gluteal muscles, yes. So the gluteal muscles on a biped are behind our leg, right? It's kind of propelling us forward a little bit. And then in a quadruped, they're kind of on the side of the leg, which is because the movement is different, in a quadruped versus a biped, and how our legs move. So the position of the gluteal muscles is a completely different position. We also have what's called a valgus knee. The femur in a biped, humans and the other bipeds in our lineage, the femur is coming in at an angle. It's kind of wider, more lateral at the hip, and then it kind of comes in at the knee. This allows for a more efficient bipedal stride, right? But in quadrupeds, it's kind of just straight up and down. There's no angle to the knee at all. And then the feet, massive differences in the feet. So one, bipeds do not have an opposable digit on their feet. We only have it on our hands, right? This is true for the others in our lineage. If we look to other apes or other primates, they also have the opposable thumb on their hands, but they also have that on their feet. So they have an opposable digit on their feet as well. But as bipeds, that would get in the way. So we are kind of the weird ones in primates in that we don't have the opposable digit on our feet, just on our hands. And then the big toe, so the technical term for big toe is hallux. So we have a non-divergent hallux. We also have 2 arches to our foot as bipeds versus like quadrupeds don't have. They only have 1 arch. So if you go to the next slide, you will see these arches. So you see the one where it's showing like the soft tissue. The transverse arch quadrupeds have and bipeds have. So that's the little one that kind of goes left to right on your foot, like a little tiny arch. And the other one is called the longitudinal arch. That's usually the arch we think of, like the arch of our foot where maybe you need like an insole. It's the one going like kind of like heel to toe, the big arch. You'll see in the bony structure on this slide that bipeds even have the bones, it's not even just soft tissue, but how the bones articulate with each other. It's set up to have that nice arch. But in the quadruped, those bones are just completely flat, right? No arch to the foot. This allows bipeds to kind of have a little shock absorption when we walk, right? And then the last slide, just the difference between habitual and obligate bipedalism. Basically, habitual is when the animal has some, morphology that is indicative of them being bipedal, but they're usually like not solely bipedal. Maybe they're bipedal sometimes, but maybe they're still in the trees and arboreal a little bit of the time. And then an obligate biped, like humans are an obligate biped. We are only bipedal. We're not bipedal sometimes, and then maybe, we're in the tree sometimes, right? We're not like using like our forelimbs or anything. We're not doing that to a degree where our body would show, oh, it's like 50-50, right? That's not the case. And you can imagine a transition period when an animal is, quadrupedal versus in that lineage, moving on to maybe another species or something in that lineage to then going from quadruped to biped, that there's going to be a period kind of in between where probably what a species is maybe doing both a little bit. So that would be like a habitual biped. The body will show indications of like, bipedalism, but will also show indications of like being arboreal or something, you know what I mean? And then for an obligate biped, the body will show just them being, like the majority of it being like fully bipedal. You might see some lingering features where you're like, oh, everything about their skeleton is indicating bipedalism, but their fingers kind of still look like they're arboreal. But remember, sometimes, if a feature isn't detrimental, it's not getting in the way, natural selection won't just like act on it for that's not how it works, right? So let's say you are fully walking bipedal, your pelvis, your legs, your head, everything about you is showing bipedal, but your finger bones are just an ancestral trait of being in the trees, a million years ago or something. Natural selection might kind of get rid of that slowly, but it's not going to be eliminated necessarily right away. So you might see, like in the human lineage, for example, an animal that is clearly fully bipedal, like an obligate biped, but maybe a couple like lingering features. So there's always kind of that period of like transitioning, right? Okay, so that's it for this one. Nice, short and sweet, fewer than 20 minutes, and I'll see you guys on the next one.